She's not a pilot. She's a PR stunt with a flight suit. That's what one cadet said as she stepped onto the tarmac. Loud, smug, confident he'd get laughs, and he did. She didn't flinch, just ran pre-flight in silence. But later, when the instructor reviewed her personnel file, his face changed. He walked outside, stood before the squad, and took off his cap. Eyes locked on her. If you believe reputation isn't given, it's flown into type airborne truth below. Lieutenant Ava Morin was accustomed to walking into rooms filled with skeptical stares and whispered assumptions. She had experienced it during her first day at West Point, where she'd been one of only 12 women in her engineering class. She had endured it again during advanced flight ground school, where her presence seemed to challenge every traditionalist's idea of what a military aviator should look like. Now standing on the concrete apron of Falcon Base's primary training airfield, she felt the familiar weight of judgment settling around her like morning fog. The day's training exercise was straightforward enough: Apache helicopter systems familiarization, followed by comprehensive pre-flight procedures, and simulated lift operations were designed to test each cadet's technical knowledge and procedural competence. But the atmosphere surrounding her participation was anything but routine. Whispers had followed her from the moment she stepped off the transport shuttle that morning. These weren't the discreet murmurs of professional assessment. They were intentionally loud comments designed to be overheard, calculated to undermine her confidence before she even had a chance to demonstrate her capabilities. One particular cadet, a tall, cocky second-year student named Henderson, leaned conspicuously toward his companion and delivered his assessment with theatrical volume. "She's not a real pilot. She's just a PR stunt wearing a flight suit." The cutting remark landed like a physical blow, reverberating across the tarmac with cruel precision. Several other cadets laughed appreciatively, some nervously joining in to avoid becoming targets themselves. No one stepped forward to correct the assumption. No one spoke in her defense or challenged the casual cruelty. Ava didn't turn around to confront her critics. She didn't offer a defensive response or attempt to justify her presence. Instead, she simply continued walking toward her assigned aircraft and began her methodical walkout inspection, her trained eyes scanning every critical component of the helicopter with the focused attention that comes from understanding that aircraft maintenance isn't about passing tests. It's about staying alive. Her flight gloves showed the telltale wear patterns of extensive flight time. Her uniform patches were positioned with military precision. She marked each checklist item with practiced efficiency, never once looking up to acknowledge the audience that was clearly expecting some kind of dramatic reaction to their harassment. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Granger, the lead flight instructor for advanced Apache training, observed the entire interaction from his position near the control tower. A 20-year veteran with multiple combat deployments and thousands of flight hours, he'd seen every type of student pilot walk through his program. He didn't intervene immediately. Part of military training involved learning to handle pressure and hostility from unexpected sources. From his vantage point, Ava appeared to be handling the situation with professional composure. She was silent, precise, and completely focused on her assigned tasks, despite the obvious attempts to distract and intimidate her. "She's probably just afraid to speak up and draw more attention." Someone behind Granger muttered, apparently assuming the instructor shared their dismissive assessment. Granger didn't respond to the comment, but something about Ava's demeanor caught his attention and held it. The way she moved around the aircraft wasn't the cautious uncertainty of a new student. It was the confident efficiency of someone who'd performed these procedures countless times under significantly more challenging conditions. Her silence wasn't born from fear or insecurity. It was the quiet competence of someone who understood that talk was cheap, but flight performance was everything. Later that afternoon, while cadets rotated through their scheduled simulation exercises and practical training sessions, Chief Warrant Officer Granger retreated to the administrative office to review the detailed background files of his current class members. This was standard procedure for any experienced instructor. Understanding each student's educational background, previous military experience, and documented strengths or weaknesses helped him tailor his teaching approach and identify potential problem areas before they became safety issues. He had already glanced through Ava's basic service record earlier in the week, commendable academic scores from West Point, consistently high marks during preliminary flight, training, no disciplinary issues or concerning incidents. Nothing in her surface documentation had particularly distinguished her from the other qualified candidates in the program, but now, prompted by his observation of her unusually composed behavior under pressure, he decided to examine her complete military transfer packet in service history. He opened her comprehensive personnel file on his computer screen. His eyes immediately stopped at the unit designation listed at the top of her previous assignment record: former unit assignment, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Airborne Night Stalkers, Granger. Blinked hard and read the line again, certain he'd misinterpreted the information that couldn't possibly be accurate. He scrolled down through additional documentation, his disbelief growing with each new piece of information. Total documented combat flight hours: 880 specialized night flight operations, 31 confirmed missions, mission classification Tier 1, direct action support, military decorations, Air Medal with Valor Device, Distinguished Flying Cross Joint Service Combination Medal, combat deployment history. Afghanistan, Iraq, classified special operations. The significance of what he was reading began to sink in with overwhelming force. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the legendary Night Stalkers, represented the absolute pinnacle of military aviation excellence. These weren't regular Army pilots who'd earned their wings through standard training programs. They were hand-selected elite aviators who flew the most dangerous missions in the most challenging conditions, often behind enemy lines, with zero margin for error. Ava hadn't mentioned any of this during her introductory presentation to the class. She hadn't written her special operations background on the whiteboard when students were asked to share their previous experience. She didn't even wear her old unit patches or display any indication of her extraordinary service record. She didn't need to advertise her credentials. Her competence spoke for itself to anyone with the wisdom to recognize it. Granger stood up from his desk, walked directly out of the administrative building, and headed toward the flight line, where students were still conducting their afternoon training exercises. The group of cadets who had been mocking Ava earlier were still gathered near the equipment benches. Apparently pleased with their morning's entertainment, Ava sat alone at a distance, quietly reading a technical manual while waiting for her next scheduled training rotation. Granger didn't approach her directly. Instead, he positioned himself approximately 5 feet away from where she was sitting, deliberately removed his military cap, held it respectfully over his heart, and said clearly enough for everyone present to hear, "Ma'am." The entire flight line fell into immediate, profound silence. Ava looked up slowly from her manual meeting, his eyes with surprise and uncertainty about this unexpected display of formal respect. One of the cadets who had been laughing earlier stammered, "Wait, what's happening?" Granger turned to address the entire group, his voice carrying the authority that comes from decades of military experience. "Lieutenant Morin flew combat missions with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Do any of you understand what that means?" Blank stares and confused expressions answered his question. "It means every single one of you owes her considerably more respect than crude jokes and ignorant assumptions. If you've ever witnessed respect arriving late but landing exactly where it belongs, share this story with someone who's forgotten how military rank is actually earned word of Lieutenant Morin's true background, spread through the cadet barracks with the speed and efficiency that only military gossip can achieve that evening." The atmosphere in the Massal was notably different. The crude jokes and dismissive comments had evaporated completely. Ava sat quietly at her usual table near the edge of the dining area, no longer isolated by mockery, but surrounded by a respectful distance that acknowledged her elevated status among the student pilots. Two of the same cadets who had participated in the morning's harassment, Henderson and his companion Martinez, approached her table hesitantly, clearly struggling with how to address someone they'd fundamentally misjudged. "Ma'am, would it be appropriate for us to join you?" Henderson asked, his earlier swagger replaced by genuine humility. Ava nodded, simply gesturing toward the empty chairs without making the moment more dramatic than necessary. They didn't offer elaborated apologies or attempt to explain away their earlier behavior. Instead, they asked the kinds of questions that reflected genuine curiosity and professional respect. "What's it actually like flying blackout missions over mountainous terrain?" Martinez inquired carefully. "Is it true that you once executed an emergency landing without communication support in Kandahar province?" Henderson added Ava didn't boast about her experiences or embellish her achievements for dramatic effect. Her responses were characteristically understated and focused on the technical aspects rather than personal heroics. Flying special operations missions is fundamentally just flying, she explained matter-of-factly, but it's flying with absolutely no margin for procedural errors or equipment malfunctions. The next morning, Chief Warrant Officer Granger brought her a cup of coffee before the day's training began, not as an apology for his initial oversight, but as a gesture of professional recognition between experienced aviators. No words were exchanged during this brief interaction, just a respectful nod that acknowledged shared understanding of what real flight experience actually means during subsequent training exercises. Ava's name was no longer mentioned in jest or dismissed with casual contempt. Instead, she was consistently called upon first for advanced simulation scenarios and complex procedural demonstrations. Other cadets began staying after their scheduled training periods specifically to observe her technique and learn from approaches that couldn't be found in standard textbooks or training manuals. Her movements around aircraft showed the intuitive efficiency that comes only from extensive real-world operational experience. She identified potential mechanical issues that newer pilots missed entirely. Her decision-making under simulated emergency conditions reflected the kind of split-second judgment that's developed through actual life-or-death situations rather than classroom scenarios. At the end of the training week before conducting final performance evaluations, Granger assembled the entire class for a comprehensive briefing about professional standards and mutual respect. Only one person in this room has flown into active combat zones where enemy fire was a constant threat. He announced, scanning the faces of every cadet present. "Only one of you has successfully executed night extraction missions under hostile conditions where mechanical failure or navigation error would have meant death for multiple personnel, and only one of you chose not to mention these qualifications during introductions." He looked directly at Ava, who was clearly uncomfortable with the public attention, but maintained her composed military bearing. That level of professional humility and quiet competence is exactly who I would choose to follow into dangerous airspace. Ava looked down, obviously preferring to avoid the spotlight. But for the first time since arriving at the training facility, the silence that surrounded her wasn't constructed from doubt, skepticism, or dismissive assumptions. It was the respectful silence of recognition, acknowledgement that true expertise doesn't need to announce itself through words or displays, but reveals itself through consistent performance and unshakable composure under pressure. The dynamic of the entire training program had shifted fundamentally, and every cadet present understood that they were learning alongside someone whose qualifications exceeded those of their instructors. 2 weeks after the revelation of Lieutenant Morin's special operations background, a photograph began circulating through military aviation forums and professional pilot networks across multiple service branches. The image showed a formation of flight training cadets standing at attention on the tarmac of Falcon Base. Chief Warrant Officer Granger stood at the front of the formation, while behind him a solitary female pilot was captured mid-step as she approached her assigned aircraft, with Granger rendering a respectful salute in her direction. The caption accompanying the viral photograph read simply but powerfully, "They called her a diversity token." Then her instructor read her file and took off his cap. The post spread rapidly through military social media channels, veteran support groups, and aviation communities. Worldwide comments poured in from pilots and mechanics and military personnel who understood the deeper significance of what the image represented. Night Stalkers don't need to brag about their missions, they just execute them perfectly and move on to the next objective. maximum respect to the quiet professionals, especially those who've flown classified missions that will never make headlines or earn public recognition. I served alongside her during Operation Enduring Freedom in Iraq. She pulled off an emergency extraction that saved our entire ground team when our primary extraction bird went down, never mentioned it afterward. This is why you don't judge people based on appearance or assumptions. Some of the most qualified people is also the most humble female pilots in special operations face double the scrutiny and have to be twice as good to earn half the respect she earned. Every bit of recognition she's getting, Ava never responded to or acknowledged the online discussion about her background. She didn't need external validation or public recognition to confirm her professional competence in military achievements. But when she returned to Falcon Base for the next training cycle with a fresh class of student pilots, she discovered that her reputation had preceded her arrival. One of the new cadets, a young second lieutenant fresh from flight school, recognized her immediately as she walked onto the flight line. "Ma'am, is it true that you flew combat missions with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment?" he asked with obvious respect and genuine curiosity. Ava paused, considering how to respond to the direct question about her service record. She smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of warmth anyone had seen from her since her arrival at the training facility. "You're here to learn how to fly military aircraft safely and effectively," she replied diplomatically. Not to follow stories about other people's previous assignments, she handed him a pre-flight checklist and added, "Focus on becoming the kind of pilot who doesn't need to talk about their qualifications because their performance speaks for itself." The lesson was clear and unmistakable true. Professionalism is measured not by the stories you tell about your achievements, but by the quality of work you demonstrate. Every single day, Eva continued her training rotation teaching by example, rather than lecture proving once again that the most effective leaders are often those who lead quietly from the front rather than loudly from behind. Her legacy at Falcon Base became a standard of excellence that challenged every subsequent class to focus on substance over appearance, competence over credentials, and performance over publicity, for more stories where silence flies further than ego ever could, and where true professionals let their work define their worth. Subscribe to Ironheart Stories.